We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
Talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words that make...
Good evening, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith. That is a pre-recorded show tonight with Ben Jacobs. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Steve. How you doing?
Great, mate. Good to see you. And as always, we are here to chew the fat about not just Newcastle United, but what's happening in football in general. And we put out a call on X for a few questions, and we weren't disappointed. So thanks to everybody who submitted the questions. Not sure we'll get through all of them, but we will do our best. Okay, Rich Joblin, he said, Ben, is it right that a rule change should come in mid-season in relation to loan players from connected clubs? It doesn't seem right. Are clubs worried about Newcastle United's business in January?
Well, I don't think this is Newcastle-centric, although Newcastle fans may view it that way, because as the question rightly alludes to, one aspect of the vote will influence third-party transactions with a connection that could see you do football business. And Ruben Neves from Al Hilal to Newcastle on a mid-season loan might be one of those. But the broader vote is more long-standing, and it hasn't just come up overnight. It's been driven by the Premier League and a number of clubs now for many months. And this doesn't just relate to football transfers. This isn't a club and a third party that is connected to them, and it's known as associated party transactions. So what we're talking about here is not just business and potentially a temporary ban blocking Newcastle. We're talking about anything where there is a connection, and as a consequence of that connection, the two parties involved may gain a mutual benefit at the expense of rivals. So this has actually been driven by commercial deals rather than necessarily transfers. And it isn't only Newcastle. It also relates, for example, to scrutiny over Chelsea and their sponsorship deal for Infinite Athlete that the Premier League took a long time making sure that they were transparent and did their due diligence before finally approving that organisation as a front of shirt sponsor, because in very basic terms, Todd Boehly has an affiliation within the Infinite Athlete family. So I think Newcastle fans will see this as something that's cropped up overnight and is designed to ultimately block a PIF-owned club doing business with a PIF-controlled club, namely for Ruben Neves. So that would be the transaction between Newcastle and Al Hilal. But it's a lot broader than that and far more complicated than that. It will impact Chelsea and their multi-club model on the football side, Chelsea and Strasbourg. It will influence City Football Group and essentially any other club that moves into a multi-club model. So Bournemouth, for example, with Bill Foley, have got a lot of different connections that they have used and will look to use both in football terms and commercially. Manchester United over time could well end up having a multi-club model because Sir Jim Ratcliffe's coming in with 25%, but Ineos also own Nice and Lausanne. So I think as football shifts and as we see what Chelsea are doing, we see what might happen at Manchester United, we know about Manchester City, and all of these other things come together to create an urgency. And effectively what is being proposed is before a solution is found, a temporary ban on associated party transactions to allow for a longer term strategy to be put in place. And now we have to wait and see whether it passes, because when you list the clubs that are going to be negatively impacted in the short term, there's more than just a handful. And this needs a majority vote of 2/3. So that's 14 of the 20 clubs. So if Manchester City and Chelsea and Newcastle and Manchester United and Bournemouth all decide that they are not going to vote because they have aspects of multi-club, then you're suddenly very tight already in getting it passed. So let's wait and see what happens. I think there's no real consensus at this point as to whether the vote will pass. The big day is on the 21st of November, and clubs are keeping their cards very close to their chests because, of course, if you're not a multi-club model at the moment, but you feel it's the way forwards, then you may be reticent to put the ban in place because who knows where you'll be over time. And if multi-club model is the future of football, then anybody that has that, or anyone like Newcastle that just has connections, even though they're not multi-club model, it's multi-club ownership or multi-club control from PIF. So Al Hilal and the PIF control clubs are not Newcastle United, but because they're PIF, it might one day be very easy to connect them. And even if you don't connect them, there still could be some kind of mutual benefit. So there's a real grey area here. We have to wait and see how the vote pans out. But I think one thing we should make clear is this isn't anti-Newcastle. It's not been sprung about because of a rumour about Ruben Neves. This is a more long-standing drive from the Premier League and many clubs to get clarity over how to deal with these associated party transactions as they're known.
Craig Ormston wants to know, what do you think the outcome of the vote will be, the Premier League vote, which of course takes place this week?
It's hard to tell because if you're looking at the clubs, as I said a moment ago, that will be negatively impacted, you would presume that they would not vote against any kind of ban. But that maybe is more black and white when you've got an obvious long-term solution, whereas what's being voted on is nothing definitive. What's being voted on is a temporary measure, which is a very key thing to illustrate, until a solution is found. And maybe that makes it more likely that it will pass. So everybody can agree to kind of freeze the associated party transactions mid-season. And it's better doing it mid-season than at the end of the season when you get a lot of new commercial deals being ultimately announced and even negotiated. Because remember, clubs are working a year ahead. And at the big clubs, at the end of this season, you're not going to be negotiating something for the next season. You're already going to have negotiated that or started to negotiate that probably a year out. So summer is the best time to do deals, whether they are deals for the forthcoming season or even the season after it. And as a result, it's better to have clarity by summer when everyone's got more time in the off season to do what they feel they need to do, to meet with partners, to negotiate deals, whether that's on the football side, the commercial side, or the strategic side. So mid-season, and because it's only a temporary measure, I think it's perhaps more likely to narrowly pass, simply because everybody accepts that it's nothing definitive. It will be followed by a period of collaboration and debate, and then there will be a long-term solution. If this was definitive now, then obviously we'd be debating the merits of it, we'd be debating the specifics of it, and so would the clubs, and then we might get a clearer position. But I, for example, spoke to the Brighton CEO, Paul Barber, when I was in Miami a couple of days for the SoccerX conference, and I asked him, how will Brighton vote? And of course, he rightly said that Brighton, like many clubs, never give away how they vote at a Premier League shareholders meeting, but he stressed the need for transparency, he stressed the need for consistency, and I think that most of us can agree on that. And not every club is equal. Not every club business model operates the same way. So it's difficult to define consistency, and it's difficult to define fair market value as well, especially at a club like Newcastle, because they're evolving at such a fast pace that a deal that appears overinflated becomes actually underinflated once they suddenly get Champions League football. And I think we had this conversation probably midway through last season when I made that exact point, that if somebody says a Newcastle United commercial deal is a sort of, in inverted commas, backhander and it's there to benefit Newcastle from a rich Saudi party that's just prepared to chuck a load of money into the club, well, then flash forwards now to Newcastle playing Champions League football and pushing again for European football. And maybe Newcastle undersold that deal, and maybe the partners got a fantastic bit of business from it all. We saw the same with Alan St. Maximin moving to Al Ahly, and everyone said Newcastle are somehow getting an incredible deal. Well, it wasn't as good as the Edward Mendy fee. It wasn't as good as the Ruben Neves fee. It wasn't as good as many other fees that have been paid to clubs that have no connection. Yet Newcastle, PIF to PIF, got a relatively moderate, a relatively what I would call fair fee for Alan St. Maximin. So again, it will always cause debate because fair market value is a little bit subjective. And I think that the vote itself is very difficult to call because we're not really voting on a solution. We're just voting on a stopgap until a solution is found. And as a result, if I had to predict, I would say it will narrowly pass simply because all the clubs want a willingness to sort this issue out fast. But obviously from Newcastle's perspective, from Manchester City's perspective and others, if there is a ban in January, then they can't go out there in the market and do those kind of deals. And I suppose the last thing I'd say is just, what does the ban mean? Well, yes, the ban would take Ruben Neves off the table, but, and we can maybe talk about this a bit later, it's not a given that Neves will leave Al Hilal just because Newcastle come calling. And beyond that, what else are we really talking about? It's unlikely there'll be any associated party commercial deals. It's unlikely there'll be any associated party partnerships. And it's reasonably unlikely that Manchester City or Newcastle will be doing too many deals in January involving their partner clubs. So I don't think the ban will have a massive impact. Maybe Chelsea, Strasbourg might have had some things planned, but I think most of the clubs will accept that it's better to just have a unified front and to commit to resolving this once and for all, which benefits the clubs that want to know how to deal with their associated parties and do business with them and do so transparently and without as much criticism or scrutiny. And it benefits the clubs that are not in this boat because they want to ultimately sign off a approach to these associated party transactions that is going to be clear for them as well, and in a way where they feel like they've had some say.
Okay, Ken Foster, good evening. He says, financial fair play, will it survive in its current form and anticipated changes due to come in over the next 3 years, in your opinion?
I think so. I mean, there'll never be a fixed financial fair play. It will always evolve with football, and that's what we're seeing with these new rule changes. So financial fair play has to adapt to club spending and stature, and also just the modern times. And if it doesn't evolve every 5 years, 10 years, however many years, then it's going to become outdated and old-fashioned. So I don't think we should look at financial fair play as a fixed set of rules. I think we should look at financial fair play in the same way that we look at VAR. Every single time something happens, there's scrutiny and debate, and it results in tweaks and changes. And the latest set of rules are a product of that. And remember also, we're not just talking about financial fair play, we're talking about domestically the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules as well. So the point of all of these rules is not, contrary, for example, to what Real Madrid and Barcelona sometimes argue, victimization or a push for equality or a push to punish clubs trying novel, creative financial maneuvers. It's not there to clamp down on the player you want your club to sign. It's not there to restrict you in the transfer market or your commercial operations. It's there to make sure that our football clubs are sustainable. And in most other businesses, if that business spent first like a football club and racked up debt like many football clubs, that business wouldn't survive. And financial fair play is there to protect, not punish. And of course, when we have breaches, people focus on the punishment, but they don't necessarily realize how many clubs are also abiding by the rules and are protected by the rules and are more sustainable as a result. So I think financial fair play is here to stay. I think it has to constantly evolve. But as I've said many times, we always focus on the negatives. We always focus on the punishments. We always focus on the can'ts. Newcastle can't spend as much as they like unless they consistently qualify for European football. Newcastle can't bring in a flagship signing and rock their wage bill because of financial fair play. Manchester United can't spend in January because of financial fair play as much as they would like to. Chelsea might be in trouble because of financial fair play. It's always negative, negative, negative. And we have to take a step back and say, isn't the whole point here that the clubs need to rein in their spending and balance what they do to the point where they're not cutting it fine, to the point where they're not spending recklessly, because you've only got a can't under financial fair play, because prior to that you had a can. So if Chelsea hadn't spent $1 billion, then entering 2024, if they wanted to sign a couple of flagship players, they could. And I think that for Newcastle, it's a bit different because they're stepping into the European market, and with that comes additional challenges. And if you want to elevate your wage bill, if you want to elevate your spending, you need it consistently as far as Europe is concerned, and then you can ultimately upgrade. It's like unlocking something. But if you spend in order to try and keep pace, and then you take a step back, you're in big trouble financially. And this is why Newcastle have been quite sensible so far. The last thing that they want to do is give everyone 170 to 350,000 pounds a week, which is your ballpark for 20 odd players at a lot of the big 6 clubs, and then find that that group of players don't want to leave if Newcastle finish 10th because they're on great money, and Newcastle have doubled their wage bill and suddenly are a mid-table Premier League club. And Brighton are very good at this because they, for example, brought in Ansu Fati, and he's the one player they've said, okay, we will pay him way more than anyone else in the team because they have to match ultimately his Barcelona wage. But that's because it's a loan and there's no real other significant costs involved. If they choose to sign the player, then you have a problem, because then you've got to set a precedent of saying, 1, here's a big transfer fee, 2, here's a big wage, 3, every other player that's done well that season for Brighton's going to turn around and say, well, I was as good as Ansu Fati. Why am I on 60,000 a week and he is on 200,000 a week? And before you know it, you get unrest. You have to give everybody an upgrade, everybody a bonus. So it's kind of a two-way process to come back to the question. Financial fair play has to adapt to the trends of the market, and the clubs have to adapt to the rules of financial fair play. And then everybody has to accept that they're going to be punished transparently and consistently if they're in breach, because then if the punishments are genuine, it becomes a deterrent and everyone kind of toes the party line a bit more. Historically, it's been more like, this is financial fair play, but if we breach it, it'll just be a warning, it'll just be a fine, it'll just be a slap on the wrist, it'll just be something we can overturn and appeal. So there's no fear factor because there's no follow through. And that's obviously why domestically, away from UEFA's financial fair play, the Everton case is going to be very interesting, because if that 10-point penalty sticks, then it sends a message to all the other Premier League clubs that there are genuine consequences. If Everton appeal that and it gets overturned and they get a tiny fine, then Manchester City, Chelsea, whoever else are just going to think, go ahead and punish us. Go ahead and slap a points deduction on us because we'll somehow get it overturned. So that's quite key, even though the City case, the Chelsea case, which hasn't even yet been levelled or charged, the Everton case, they're very different. So we need to be careful about grouping them together. But if Everton does genuinely become an upheld 10-point deduction after appeal, then it's a start, because it says to the other 19 clubs, the profit and sustainability has a deterrent. And if you breach the rules, there's going to be follow through and there's going to be lasting consequences that might just cost you your place in the league.
David Cook on Facebook says, on a more serious note, what are the expected implications and timescales, do you think, Ben, for Chelsea and Man City? And are there any other clubs on the radar?
Well, I think that when you look at the three cases, they're very different. So Everton was a smaller period and it was linked to the COVID leeway, which Everton were deemed to have taken advantage of in order to ultimately balance the books by inflating COVID losses. So that's a bit more clear cut in terms of the case that was being looked at and the time frame, and that's why it's been able to move a little bit faster. Still not as fast, by the way, as people would have liked. The judgment came out in November. The original aim was to try and get it done in June. And with the appeal, that could still last months. So it's going to be very interesting to see whether there's any full clarity now before the end of the season. I would have thought that that will also be fast-tracked, because it's difficult if you don't resolve it before the end of the season and Everton are relegated, but if you add 10 points, they're safe, and you don't resolve it until, let's just say, August next year, and then the championship season kicks off and Everton win their appeal, then they will argue that they should still be in the Premier League. And what can you do about that? So I think all parties will want to resolve it during this season. So there's no debate over whether Everton could get the 10 points back or can't get the 10 points back. If they're going to get the 10 points back, it has to be during the season, not after the season ends. Otherwise, it opens up an entire new can of worms. With Manchester City, I think we could be looking at years, genuinely, because there's all manner of charges. And unlike with the UEFA case, there is no limit on how far back the Premier League can go. So that can get bogged down in the legal system. And I think that it will be surprising if we get any speedy resolution there. With Chelsea, it's tough because we're not talking about any new level charges yet. We're talking about speculation. So the Chelsea situation was when the new ownership joined the club, they realized there was a liability from the Abramovich side on the books. So they offset about 100 million. And then as they continued to do due diligence and understand the situation, they declared that issue to UEFA and reached a settlement. And from the 100 million that they set aside, I think they paid just under 9 million. And obviously, the Premier League can look further back, but if it's the same problem, just domestically and further back, then will the Premier League also be happy to do what UEFA did and engage with a new ownership that have self-declared? Or will they ultimately just punish the club, regardless of the fact that it happened under previous ownership? And if you're Manchester City, because it's not previous ownership, they know their books, they know what's gone on. If anything, as they did successfully at the Court of Arbitration for Sport, it might be easier for them to defend it because they know where and I do say this a bit flippantly, but the skeletons are buried. With Chelsea's ownership, they don't really know what's happened because it was all under Abramovich. And even when they were buying the club, it was really difficult with a tight timescale to actually discover the books. They couldn't do a standard due diligence. They had to work at super speed, and the account side, as far as Abramovich was concerned, very complicated. So as a result, the Chelsea owners may not quite know what they're in for. And whether that's a positive or a negative, you can argue it both ways. The positive is that if the ownership can't even get to the bottom of Abramovich's books, then good luck to the Premier League trying to do the same. And there might not be enough that's conclusive if charges are leveled. The flip side is that it may be harder to legally defend if you're the new ownership because they were not behind it. Whereas with Manchester City, they're obviously going to have a robust defence because whatever practices they've been carrying out, they believe are above board. Whereas the Chelsea ownership may discover something on the Abramovich side and just think, yikes, we've got no defence here. We weren't a part of it. We don't want to be a part of it. We just have to do what we did with the UEFA to the Premier League and hold our hands up and say this happened before us. And then it's solely in the hands of the Premier League how they choose to proceed. So they're very different cases. I would say there's a lot of scaremongering going on at the moment, 30-point deductions, automatic relegation, and it's all off the back of the Everton 10 points. And a lot of it is guesswork because there's no precedent at the moment. You've got to read the ruling, you've got to understand the legal repercussions for Everton, then you've got to wait and see whether it stands or it's reduced or it's overturned, because that will have an impact. If 10 points becomes 0 and Everton have no punishment, then Manchester City and Chelsea, if they end up being charged, will obviously be delighted by that. If it stays at 10 points, if it increases to 20 points, then you have to assume that 115 charges is going to have a more severe punishment than the Everton one. And as I said before, with Chelsea, nothing's actually been charged at this point. So we have to be very careful about grouping the clubs together. We have to be very careful about creating headlines based upon relegation of Manchester City and Chelsea, 30-point deduction. There's no credible source around there at the moment indicating any of that. Because how can you indicate it with Chelsea when you've not even charged them with anything yet? How can you indicate that with Manchester City yet when it's still an ongoing legal process? It's purely analysis from the outside. So I respect the sports lawyers that understand the terrain, and I expect the financial experts that understand the severity. And of course, they're the ones to listen to. But anyone second guessing at the actual punishment is basically preempting something that hasn't yet run its course, which is why I'm a little bit more cautious on the matter. And then as far as other clubs are concerned, we have to wait and see. It's obvious that all the clubs will have the same scrutiny. It's obvious that the Premier League are not just turning a blind eye anymore. Ahead of this football regulator coming in, they're trying to be as robust and as aggressive as they can. So we certainly can't rule out other clubs being investigated. But at the moment, we're waiting on the next step with Chelsea and whether they're going to be charged. We're waiting on how long the Manchester City charges are going to take to run their course. And it could get bogged down and take ultimately years to run its full course. And then obviously with Everton, it's a bit more super speed. And for that one, we're waiting to see whether they're successful in their appeal. So it's probably a bit too early to be making sweeping predictions at this stage. But I think the next thing to look out for, as I said a moment ago, is Everton. Do they overturn the 10-point penalty? And if they do, was this a statement from the Premier League? Was this hard line in order to deter other clubs? Or are they genuine in believing that this is the right punishment and a proportionate punishment? And if the appeal is rejected, that sends a message to all of the Premier League. If the appeal is overturned, then we're kind of back where we started. And some of the other clubs that are being scrutinised might just turn around and say, so what? Do your worst. We'll get it overturned as well. So this is why I think we need to wait a little bit longer rather than getting drawn in by tabloid headlines talking about big clubs being relegated before Chelsea charges have even been tabled and before the Manchester City case is even resolved.
Okay, time for a quick ad break.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces. They are handmade in Cumbria. If you want to order some of these sauces, call 01768 210 102 or go to the website mrvickys.co.uk. Thanks again to United Group Travel. They are a UK coach holiday firm and they are based in Morpeth with pickups throughout the northeast. No strangers on our tours, just people you haven't met yet. They're on Facebook. They've also got a website, unitedgrouptravel.com, or give them a call 01670 632 460 or 0791 666 4174 or 07957 141 654. Big thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals. They're an independent funeral director based in Gateshead. You can find them at their website, darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk, or give them a call 0191 478 2730 or email Darren at darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Big thanks to Neil and the lads at Media Arts for all the help with the video side of things. And a big thank you to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. If you want to help the channel, then please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button underneath today's video. Hit the thumb up, which helps you like the video, and please click share and share it to your other social media. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. If you want to help the channel, you could take out a one-off membership. You get a cup, a pen, a membership card, and a scarf. It's a £25 one-off fee, and you can go to nufcmatters.com and click membership, or put your smartphone over this QR code and it will take you straight there. We also help the food bank on this channel. If you want to help the food bank virtually from wherever you are in the world, click on nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and it takes you to the matchday bucket and you can make a donation no matter how big or small. I'm also involved in the Northeast Footy Breakfast Show. You can find us on the tuneuk.com. I do Monday to Friday with Ted, the Sunderland fan, and Rye, the Borough fan, and Radio Dad Dave. Lots of fun, 7 till 9 every morning. Give us a listen, you'll not regret it. We also help support people in the area who are putting events on. An evening with Nobby Solano takes place on the 19th of January at the Tyneside Irish Club. And an evening with Peter Beardsley takes place at the Tyneside Irish Centre the week before, on January the 12th. Tickets for both events are available on Voucher and would make fantastic Christmas presents for anyone of a black and white persuasion.
Okay, Sean Caven sent us a question. He says, Ben has written many an article or put a tweet out about Saudi Arabia since Newcastle's takeover, but he says, I've never come across an article or tweet by any journalist condoning Thailand's human rights record. He says, as a Leicester City fan, why is that?
Well, I think it got quite a lot of scrutiny actually within the Leicester community when the new ownership group took over, and also when Leicester won the Premier League as well. I went over to Thailand 2 weeks before Leicester officially lifted the Premier League trophy and a week after. And I also made a documentary on Leicester's Premier League win where I spoke to the unfortunately now deceased owner and his son, the current chairman of Leicester, Top. So Kung Vishai and Top were asked about things like that, both by the local press that were at certainly the events that I went to. And for them in particular, it was more about the connection that they had with the King of Thailand within the duty-free world, because at that point, King Power had a real monopoly in Thailand and across other parts of Asia as well. So sometimes these things are asked, but maybe not just seen or read. And other times, I think that it's just fair to say that a fan sees certain headlines more because they relate to their club. And I suppose the last thing to say, with respect to Leicester and strictly in a sporting context, is that even though, as the question says, the wider issue outside of sport is important to put scrutiny on, sports journalists cover sport. So if Newcastle are making waves or Manchester City are making waves, and there's a wider conversation to be had that connects back to sport in any way, it will be had. Whereas with Leicester, it's a smaller club, there's a smaller pool of people interested, and as a consequence in the UK press, there's probably a little bit of a diminished coverage in all areas. And that obviously leads itself towards less headlines relating to anything like human rights. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just the reality. If you Google a big team and Google a small team, the headlines for the big team, the interest in the big team, the clicks for the big team, the money the big team makes by writing that story will all outnumber that of the smaller team. So I think it is just a reality that sport as a sector is not the primary driver for limelight on any of these things, but it can be very useful to put a spotlight on a certain issue. But when it tends to happen, the team or the event is often bigger. And we see that with the Qatar World Cup. We may see that with the 2034 World Cup in Saudi Arabia. We would see that had Manchester United been taken over by Qatari ownership. We see that with Manchester City. And now we're seeing that with Newcastle United. If PIF bought Charlton Athletic, then there would probably be less scrutiny. There was less scrutiny when Sheffield United were taken over by their Saudis. And that may irk Newcastle fans, but it is just the reality of the fact that bigger clubs get more coverage. But if you look deeper and in multiple languages, and historically, specifically around when Leicester won the Premier League in 15-16, I think you might be surprised at just how much you find that does touch upon some of these issues that the question mentioned.
Okay, good stuff. We never avoid questions on here. Ben is always very forthright, always gives his opinion. Wilson P, thank you for your question. He says, I'd like Ben's opinion on this. Why was Anthony Taylor stood down when he gave the Wolves penalty? This is the penalty that Newcastle gained against Wolves in the game at Molineux. He says, surely he was on-field ref and was a live call. He never got sent to the monitor. Surely it should be the VAR official that made the error. Couldn't understand it. Although we probably made a wrong call in the past, we moved on. What's your thoughts on that one? Because we had the big reveal, of course, on Sky at the start of the week, which saw Arteta charged for his histrionics after the game against Newcastle, which saw that Anthony Gordon goal given, which he wasn't very happy about. But the Wolves one is what Wilson would like to get your opinion on.
Yeah, I mean, VAR agreed with Taylor that the spot kick stood. So it's difficult to decide who's to blame, if you like, because we want our referees to be accountable. And remember, VAR are guided that they're supposed to uphold an on-field decision unless there's clear and obvious evidence against it. So there's all manner of different things in this. One is, can a referee get a subjective call technically wrong if you forensically analyze it, but after viewing it, it's still 50-50. And then the VAR decide that the spirit of the game is to uphold the referee's decision. Then if you look at it afterwards again, over and over and over, and you decide it was the wrong call, who's to blame? Because VAR may say, well, yeah, we empathize with the counter decision, but there wasn't enough clear and obvious error. I think ultimately the Newcastle goal at Arsenal is a good example of that. If you give VAR half an hour, then they may be able to find a way of looking at different things to do with the ball going out. They may be able to look at the offside and the foul in a lot more detail, but you've got a split-second decision. So I think Taylor took the brunt of that because the on-field decision was penalty. VAR uphold that. And I think that it may be a case that the on-field official has to be the one that is accountable first and foremost. Otherwise, if you're only punishing VAR, or if you're punishing VAR as the culprit that didn't catch it, then you're taking all the power away from the referee. What's the point in even having a referee in the center of the field? Why don't you just do everything with video analysis? So I think that's why Taylor got the brunt of the criticism in that game. But I've got to be honest, I'm massively against demotion, as it's called, and as it was. I'm massively against the idea that a referee cannot be allowed to be in charge of a certain club, because referees are human, and we either invest in VAR and find a way of it coexisting with humans and subjective decisions and having the game flow, or we go back to where we were before and we let referees be a part of the game. And referees are meant to be exactly that. We talk about it on the terraces. We debate decisions. If you go back 20 years, certain refs were more card happy. Certain refs gave more penalties. Certain refs had different personalities. Certain refs were more free. And I like baseball. I may have made this analogy before, where the umpire behind home plate defines the home plate. And some umpires have a stricter home plate and some have a more generous home plate. And in a baseball game, if you watch it closely, each umpire defines that pitch zone per game. And after a innings or two, the pitcher starts to realize and the batter starts to realize what's being called a strike and what's being called a ball. But no two umpires are the same, and nobody really cares because they're, again, a part of the game and it's subjective. Whereas with referees, we want definitive. And you're never going to get definitive in a sport like football with every single decision. There's always going to be debate. Nothing's ever going to be 100%, even with the technology. And some people love that and some people hate that. But to demote a referee or to say a referee is not going to be able to officiate a particular team, I think sets a very dangerous precedent. Because once you've done it once, What about next week, the week after, the week after? We're not even halfway through the season. By the end of the season, how many refs will have been demoted? How many refs will be barred from officiating teams that they've made errors for? And before you know it, we're going to be short of refs. It is much better that we find a balance of how to use VAR. And I think that one of the solutions, as you sort of alluded to in your question, is using the monitor more. So that is accountability. Instead of just VAR saying it's clear cut, we've drawn the lines, we've made the decision. If there's any doubt, if there's any contention, if there's any debate, make sure that the ref goes to the monitor. Because if the ref doesn't go to the monitor, how can they change their mind? How can they input? How can they ask any questions? How can they be a part of the process? And even if they don't go to the monitor, there's got to be a way of kind of having a small iPad or something strapped to the back of them or to their arm. So when VAR happens, they can watch the live process. And obviously that will still allow them to go to a monitor or maybe see it on that screen. But it feels very strange to me that when sometimes we have a contentious decision, VAR do all of the legwork, they come to a conclusion. In this case, they confirm the decision and the referee doesn't get another look at it. And the reason why he doesn't go to the monitor is because the decision's being confirmed. So why does he need to go to the monitor if he thinks it's one thing and then the video officials tell him that they've confirmed it's that decision? But I still think that if there's any debate in confirming the decision, even if they're 90-10, yeah, we're confirming your decision, they should say to Anthony Taylor, look, there's a 10% argument you got it wrong, but we're 90% in agreement with you. It's a subjective call to some extent. We're backing your call, but go and have another look at it. And then you can make the final decision. But because that doesn't happen, there's a disconnect with that type of decision between the on-field crew and the video crew. And the video crew have the last call. And it removes all the power from the officials, which I think is worrying because we still want our human referees on the field to be the primary decision makers and the final authority. And in that particular instance, he was, in the sense that VAR confirmed his decision, but he wasn't in the sense that in confirming the decision, he never got the opportunity or he never chose to have the opportunity to take a second look at it. And this, I think, is vital, even if it adds a bit more time to the game, because if we don't engage with the technology and connect those in the video room with those on the field, then this problem is only going to get worse and worse and worse, because eventually people will start saying, well, who is the actual official here? Who's the point of contact? Do I talk to the referee? Do I talk to the fourth official who's in communication? Can we talk directly to the VAR room? It all just feels very disconnected and panicky at the moment. So hopefully we'll get a resolution, but I'm not in favor of officials getting demoted. I think that sets a very dangerous precedent. And I think that it'd be much better for an official's authority to remove that aspect. Otherwise, every single club under the sun, when they get a decision against them, is going to be asking for the official to get punished.
Great stuff, Ben. As always, covered a multitude of questions there. Got through most of them as well. Look forward to having you on again soon, mate. Take care.
Always a pleasure, and good luck to Newcastle as they return from the international break.
Take care, mate.